Coming up today on Uncommon Sense, we're going to talk to Joseph Pearce, renowned author and biographer. We'll talk to him about his upcoming talk at the 41st Annual Chesterton Conference, and we'll also talk about the 4th of July, Chesterton, and freedom. Stay tuned. Okay, great to have you on with us today, Joseph. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Also joined here with my co-host, Albert Sines.
Hello, hello.
All right. Well, today, being the day after the 4th of July, we thought we would have an Englishman on to talk to us about Chesterton and freedom. And, kind of interested too, Joseph, in you've chosen America as your country. Chesterton had a love for America, and Americans love to talk about that a little bit. But first, why don't you give us a brief introduction of yourself for our guests who may not know you and know what you do?
Okay, so I'm an author of around 30 or so books now, including biographies of G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, and some books on Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and others. I also edit the St. Austin Review, and I'm series editor of the Ignatius Critical Editions. I'm director of book publishing with the Augustine Institute, and I'm probably forgetting this, that, or the other. I write for various online journals, including the Imaginative Conservative and Crisis magazine, for which I am senior contributors to both of those. I teach for Homeschool Connections. I keep myself busy, basically.
Nice, wonderful. So before we dive into things like the 4th of July and Chesterton and freedom, would you mind just giving us a little preview of what you're going to talk about at the conference this year?
Yes, so I'm going to be speaking about how G.K. Chesterton saved me from anti-Semitism. So it's going to be a conversion story. I wrote a book called Race with the Devil, My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love. And as a young man, at the age of 15, in fact, I joined a white supremacist organization in England called the National Front. And I was involved in that for 11 years and went to prison twice for hate crimes. So I was the one person under grace that saved me from that life of hatred and racism was G.K. Chesterton. So I always say that my first book as a Catholic was the biography of Chesterton, and that was an act of thanksgiving to God for giving me Chesterton, and an act of thanksgiving to Chesterton for giving me God. So I have a great debt of gratitude to the great G.K. Chesterton because he led me away from hatred and darkness, anti-Semitism, racism, to the light and love of Jesus Christ. And so for that, I mean, there's no greater gift someone can bestow on someone else. So obviously to God be the glory. So it's all under grace, but under grace, the most important single person in my conversion and deliverance is G.K. Chesterton.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm definitely looking forward to hearing that talk at the conference this year. This will be Albert's first conference, so he's going to be baptized by fire a little bit.
It'll be a good experience, though, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
The Chesterton Conference is very, very special. It's my favorite conference of the year. It's one I always look forward to, and it's more about the conviviality than the talks. Actually, the talks are just the excuse to get people together. And the talks are great. I don't want to belittle them, but really it's about the people getting together and the Chestertonian spirit of joie de vivre, that rambunctiousness that's just part of the spirit of the conference. So you're in for a great time. And by the way, there's an old tradition that I set up about 2 seconds ago, that when I see someone who's coming to the conference for the first time, they need to buy me a beer.
That's your job, Albert.
I will keep some change in my pocket, and I will buy you a beer, sir. Guaranteed.
Thank you so much, Albert.
But I do want to ask you a question, Joseph. So the theme for this conference this year is Chesterton and conversion, learning to think again. So obviously you have a conversion story, but your conversion story is wrapped up in Chesterton saving you from anti-Semitism. So the conversion part aside, do you think that the need to sort of witness your story on your change from your sort of days of racial hatred and racial injustice, and being saved from anti-Semitism, that's really important in society right now, that people need to hear stories like yours?
Yeah, I think on two distinct levels, absolutely, this is important. On the more general level, the fact that I was so far from Christ and completely and utterly embroiled in an ideology of hatred, and living a dissolute life in all sorts of other ways, I hope shows anybody who's in a bad place that nobody's in such a bad place that they're beyond the reach of the love of Jesus. So that's one thing I hope is, people can see, well, yeah, I'm in a bad place, but look at him. So that's one thing. And then in a more particular sense, obviously we live in very racially charged times now, where the socialists left have become racially obsessed. It used to be about class warfare; it's now about race warfare. And the problem with that, of course, is the danger of a reaction on the part of a certain parts of the white population, that they take an antagonistic view to such a degree that they start buying into the white supremacist ideologies and the hatred. And so that's a real danger. And in fact, I get emails from people all the time that either are involved, tempted to become involved, or have been involved, and are talking about their experience. So it is an issue. And I'm very pleased that my past and my experience allows me to, if you like, shed some light and the love of Christ into those dark corners of the human soul that are prone to racism and hatred.
That's beautiful. It's encouraging to me that there's someone like you out there just to almost counsel people who either have been through that or attempted to indulge in those tendencies. Because, yeah, I agree. I think we're in a very difficult time in our nation's history where we're sort of balanced between two extremes, and it's volatile.
Amen.
Well, I think that was a great little preview. Maybe now would be a good time to sort of take a commercial break for the conference, and then we can talk about Chesterton and freedom. Albert, would you mind just reminding us how wonderful the conference is going to be?
I can do that. So, ladies and gentlemen, during this break, we want to remind everyone about our upcoming annual Chesterton conference. We are less than a month away now. It's going to take place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on July 28th through the 30th. This year's theme, as you heard me mention, is Chesterton and conversion, learning to think again. We've got a full lineup of speakers: Dale Ahlquist, Christopher Check, the president of Catholic Answers, and of course, Joseph Pearce, who we are talking to, and many more. But this year is going to be extra special for everyone because this conference will mark the 100th anniversary of Chesterton's own conversion to the Catholic faith, which took place on July 30th, 1922. So on the last day of the conference, we get to celebrate. And so we look forward to being able to celebrate that great occasion in the life of G.K. Chesterton, a thinker and a writer who has influenced the conversions of so many people, like Joseph, and did those conversions throughout his lifetime and well beyond his lifetime, because he is still influencing many people. So for more information and to register for the conference, please visit chesterton.org/conference. And hopefully you can still find a way to be there, because we'd love to see you. And there will be a virtual option. So if you can't be there, please tune in for the virtual option. So thank you for that. And as we return now to Uncommon Sense, the official podcast of the Society of G.K. Chesterton. Grettelyn, back to you.
Wonderful, wonderful. I specifically wanted to bring up a quote that is much quoted about America and Chesterton, where he said, America is the only nation in the world that is founded on a creed. That creed is set forth with dogmatic and even theological lucidity in the Declaration of Independence, perhaps the only piece of practical politics that is also theoretical politics and also great literature. Um, I think that's sort of wonderfully Chestertonian and charged, as all Chestertonian quotes are. Do you have any initial thoughts on that, Joseph, before we dive in more?
Well, yes, Chesterton and his brother Cecil were great admirers of the United States. Cecil Chesterton, of course, wrote a history of the United States, one of the few books he was able to write before his untimely death in World War One. So both of them admired the United States. Obviously, Chesterton was also critical of certain aspects of the consumerism and materialism. For instance, when his talk, one of my favorite talks that he gave was a talk called "Culture and the Coming Peril." And he said in that talk that most people, and this was only about 10 years or so after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, he said most people think that the coming peril is Bolshevism, but he said that the coming peril is not Bolshevism because the best way of destroying a utopia is to try it. So first of all, great words of prophecy, right? You put Marxism into practice, it will collapse in its own ultimate self-contradictions. But he then said, so the ultimate peril, he says, the coming peril is not Bolshevism, but standardization by a low standard. In other words, the dumbing down of everything to a lowest common denominator. And one of the dangers of should we say, a crass form of consumerism is that where it leads to, and Chesterton saw, I think quite rightly, the United States as the trailblazer in that direction. So, on the one hand, you had in Russia this evil of communism, but we also have this evil of the dumbing down of everything, the standardization by a low standard, which certainly not only the United States is to blame for that, but the United States have certainly blazed the trail that many others have been very happy to follow.
Yep. Yeah. Amen. And there's another quote that I don't remember who said it, but you kind of are what you're expected. You become what you're expected to be. So if the expectation is always a low standard, you're gonna kind of sink to that standard. Unfortunately. Yeah, but it's interesting that Chesterton could point out that this nation was founded on higher ideals. And I know that there's another Chesterton quote that I'm going to get wrong, where he said that you need ideals in order to have reality. Maybe you remember that better than I do, but there's the idea that you have to have this idealization of what should be in order to have a good version of what is. Um,
Yeah, first thing I would say, by the way, is that it's a duty of all Chestertonians to misquote Chesterton, because Chesterton was always misquoting everybody else. I think if you're fastidious enough to get the Chesterton quote exactly right, you're not being Chestertonian. So
Amen.
bravo to you for misquoting.
If it's worth doing, it's worth doing badly, right?
Amen.
Yeah, and there's actually another quote though by Chesterton that I think is very confusing, where he says something like, "There's nothing wrong with the real American. That what's wrong with America is the ideal American." And I haven't read that in context in a long time, but I was baffled by that when I was trying to prep for this a little bit and think of good things to talk about. And I don't know if you have any insight into that.
Well, the first thing that strikes us, of course, is how that quote contradicts the earlier quote about the United States being founded on a creed. In other words, on an ideal. Okay, and in the latter quote, he's talking about was the ideal that's the problem, not not the real American, but the ideal American. And I think that we have to be fair to Chesterton here, because I think obviously he wrote those two things years apart, and so it's unfair to juxtapose two things that weren't meant to be juxtaposed. In the earlier, he's speaking specifically about the founding and specifically about a certain text called the Declaration of Independence, for which he has a great deal of respect. In the latter quote, he's talking about the modern, dumbing down, crass, materialistic United States of his own time of the 1920s and 30s. So there's a chasm that exists between the ideal as seen by the founding fathers and the ideal as seen by many modern Americans.
Mm.
And they're not the same thing. And in fact, the founding fathers would be turning in their grave if they saw some of the things that were being done in the name of being American these days. So I think that's what Chesterton's getting at in those two quotes.
If you, it's interesting. We talk about the founding fathers, and the country and the trajectory that it has headed from those initial days. If you go to the Jefferson Memorial on the Tidal Basin in DC and you just look at the quotes that are imprinted on the walls of the Jefferson Memorial, you see that we have come so far from the initial ideals of those men who sat and wrote with great fervor and allegiance to the higher God and what they wanted and what they expected of this country and where we are now. And you say, they turned over in their graves. I think they've turned over multiple times. I mean, it's and somehow we want to say that this is all what we leave it to people that are hundreds of years separated to interpret. And I think we don't have to interpret. It's very clear what they said. It's very clear. I think Chesterton would be in agreement because he was such a man of very common truth, very simple truth, very clear truth. And there's no need to try to reinterpret what the founding fathers wanted. They said it very clear, but we want to try to insert our own ideals. We want to insert our own ideas. We want to put in, well, I'm pretty sure that they would have meant this if they knew what was happening today. And I want to say, I'm pretty sure that they wouldn't. So here we are.
Yeah, Chesterton has a wonderful quote that's applicable to what you've just said. He said, "It doesn't matter how much I make the point of a story stick out like a spike, the critics will go in carefully and impale themselves on something else." It doesn't matter how obvious what the Declaration of Independence actually says, people will manage to make it say something else if they don't want to see what's really there.
Just because you were born in England and raised there, as your accent tells.
Wait, I thought he was from Jersey.
I don't know.
Do you mean Jersey, or do you mean that New Jersey?
I was going to say
that newfangled thing. Because Jersey is one of the Channel Islands, actually, on the English Channel, just south of England, off the coast of France.
Gotcha,
just so you know, we're dealing with originals here, not copies, right?
There was a Jersey, so watch out.
Please forgive me. I beg your forgiveness.
There is a Jersey, actually. There is a Jersey.
I believe you.
But he's not from Jersey either, so. But just kind of
either Jersey or New Jersey. I'm from neither.
Neither, yeah. Just as an. You're not an outsider at this point. I don't know. I wouldn't. I don't know if you consider yourself that. I wouldn't say you are. I think you're an American at this point. But maybe I'm wrong to say that. But as someone who has come from the outside, like what are your impressions of America? Maybe in comparison with Chesterton's.
Well, the first thing is that I am a US citizen now. I'm also a UK citizen, so I'm a dual citizen. But one of the ironies is that that for someone who spent his ill-spent youth in a white supremacist organization opposing immigration, to spend the second half of my life as an immigrant is indeed a great sign of the ironic sense of humor of the divine providence in which we're living. But the experience of being an immigrant is very interesting because, am I an American? Well, I think that my experience would be the same as every other first generation American. In other words, every other immigrant, that you bring with you the culture and heritage and personal experience of the culture from which you came. And, it would be, I think, reprehensible to try to abandon that, because that's part of who you are. That's your rootedness. It's part of the European heritage of the United States, in my case, European heritage. But at the same time, when in Rome, do as the Romans. You don't come to a new country. And the United States has been very, very good to me. I've been very blessed by my experience here. And so I owe a debt of gratitude to the United States as a nation. And that sense of gratitude needs to be expressed when I talk about the United States. And the other thing, of course, is although I would still call myself an Englishman primarily and not an American, my children, of course, are Americans, and that's the way it should be, right? My daughter has an American accent. She was born in South Carolina. So that's the way it should be. So she will be fully fledged American, hopefully, nonetheless, very conscious of her English roots, but nonetheless an American. That's the healthy way that, if you like, waves of immigrants come in, embrace the host culture without abandoning the culture from which they came, and enriching the United States through that process.
Beautiful. Love it. Very nice. Uh, and I mean, you probably know, because you're a citizen and you've had to take tests to become one, you probably actually know more American history than a lot of run-of-the-mill Americans.
The actual test to become a U.S. citizen was so, was it that standardization by a low standard? It
Mm,
was actually, it was so simple. It was almost impossible to fail. I mean, I spent some time reviewing for it, so I was in good shape and confident, but I needn't have bothered, quite
mm.
frankly.
That's kind of a bummer. Oh man. Well, either way, it's interesting that I would think that you, though, even just from your review, you probably do know a bit more American history than is even taught today, unfortunately, um, in our country. Uh, but so we have this ideal, this creed that supposedly America was founded on, that hopefully America was founded on. Um, as set forth in the Declaration of Independence, but it's sort of become this excuse me, it's become this other thing, uh, maybe twisted, because I feel like there's a great deal of dodging of responsibility in our country these days, and the Declaration of Independence in many ways was a call to a very high level of responsibility, responsibility to God in some ways for the humanity, the human that he created you to be. Um, so I don't know. Do you have any comments on where we've kind of slid from that?
Well, the founding fathers knew that the cement that holds a culture together and a society together is virtue. And virtue ultimately can be summed up very simply. Virtue is laying down your life for the other. So, in other words, self sacrifice. The absence of virtue is laying down the life of others for the self.
Hmm.
Self-centeredness, right? So the founding fathers understood these basic laws of ethics, and that without virtue, everything falls apart. And a major reason for the Declaration of Independence being written as it was to try as far as possible to put a mechanism in place which would encourage virtue, but B, stop the absence of virtue from destroying the culture. That's what it's there for. There's an apparatus to stop the whole thing dissolving in the absence of virtue, because they had enough of an understanding of human nature to know that that you can't just rely on everybody being good. You've got to put mechanisms in place that protect the actual structure of the nation against the destructiveness of vice,
Hmm.
of viciousness.
Hmm. Well, and it was kind of, the age of enlightenment period, and ideas were everywhere. And I think there was maybe even a more of an understanding of what ideas could do than there is now, because ideas were pushing people to do things.
Yeah, I mean, there's the thing with relativism. Once it's embraced, it is a downward spiral towards nihilism. In
Hmm.
other words, towards the fact that there is no truth. And if there is no truth, then you're not held to any objective criteria with respect to how you should behave. So, or of course, you're not held to any objective criteria as how to judge the truth of an idea. So, so ideas are, but it's just an idea becomes an opinion, not something which is objectively verifiable or arguable, just an opinion, like all other opinions. It's complete, standardization of all ideas, the lowest common level of opinion. Well, that's your opinion. At that point, it's the end of all engagement with objectivity, with objective reality, with the real. It's all about what's in here narcissistically, and that's what's happening now with the dissolution of American culture. And of course, it's completely unsustainable. If we don't back off from that trajectory, we end up with one hell of a crash.
And it's a very depressing attitude. I mean, if if there's nothing greater than me, that's kind of sad, you know. If I am,
Look, Grettelyn, look at the people that hold that opinion. They're the saddest
hmm
people going.
yeah,
That's the irony is that the pursuit of self-centered happiness makes you miserable.
yes,
You look where that philosophy takes hold, suicide rates drug abuse, all of this and attempt to make oneself instantly gratified leads to a downward spiral of addiction and absolute misery for the individual. So if we put ourselves first, we actually end up being last in the sense that we end up being ultimately miserable. We put ourselves last, in other words, we give ourselves to others, we end up being first because we actually live much more happy and fulfilling lives. And then all of this, of course, is fulfilled ultimately in eternity. But nonetheless, even in this life, an act of self-sacrifice makes us happier than a life of self-indulgence.
You said, Joseph, self-centered happiness. You said the pursuit of self-centered happiness, and it sounded to me like that would be a lot of people's reinterpretation of the Declaration of Independence, where it says the pursuit of happiness, and now people are pursuing their self-centered happiness, which, of course, for all the reasons that you said, it's very destructive and in no way will support a nation if everyone is concerned with just themselves. And I feel like Chesterton.
I mean, the problem with that relatively brief document that's endeavoring to encapsulate universal principles is that words will be used that are not sufficiently defined.
Mm-hmm.
So, words like happiness, the devil's in the definition or absence thereof.
Sure.
And same thing with things like love or pride. Okay, we use these words with very different meanings. And unless we're going to be very, very careful to define what we mean when we use words like love or pride or happiness, we are just going to confuse ourselves and others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that the word liberty has been vastly misused over and over and over in our country's history.
My favorite paradoxical quote about liberty actually is not by Chesterton. It's by Oscar Wilde. And in one of his poems, he says, "Anarchy, freedom's own Judas." Which basically is another way of saying what Edmund Burke said, that liberty itself must be limited in order to be possessed. In other words, self-limitation, selflessness is necessary for freedom. If we will not self-limit, we will be slaves.
Right.
Well, it's a similar concept to saying freedom does not mean you are free to do whatever you want. That's not real freedom, because as you said, you become a slave to it, because then you pursue anything that you want, whether it's moral or immoral, and you say, well, I'm free to do that. It's like, yes, you are, but you've become a slave to that very thing. So no, you are not free, because you've sort of indulged in your own interpretation of freedom.
Yeah, and basically that sort of freedom actually becomes an addiction. And an addict is not free. And the other thing about it, of course, is one of the reasons that liberty has to be limited is because it has to be subject to the common good. In other words, no one says that I have a right to go out and kill my neighbor. Nobody says I have a right or the freedom. Let's use the word freedom. I have the freedom to go out and kill my neighbor. I have the freedom to go out and rape somebody. I have the freedom to abuse a child. No one says that I have that freedom, because those freedoms are absolutely a denial of the freedom of other people. So, obviously our own freedom has to be circumscribed by our relationship with our neighbors. And any sane society has embraced that as a central axiom of their political philosophy. Once you lose that in the libertine anarchy and nihilism of what's being put forth now in modern American culture, you do end up with the anarchy. And of course, what happens when you have anarchy? When there's no law whatsoever, it's the gang that rules, right? It's the most ruthless that rules. Everybody else lives in fear. And the best case scenario then actually is the tyrant. In other words, a really big guy comes along who puts all the gangs in place, right? Who brings that law and order back to the street, and we're all living, at least in a slavery where we're not going to be raped or mugged when we leave the house because of the gangs on the street. So you end up with totalitarianism as the better of two evils. Well, isn't it better to avoid both of those scenarios by limiting our liberty and living virtuously, so we can actually have maximize the genuine, authentic, bona fide freedom that a true free society, in other words, a Christian society based upon self-limitation and self-sacrifice, gives to us.
But you said, well, there's the problem. You said virtuously. We've lost track of virtue in a very extreme way. You say virtue to people, be like, what do you mean virtue? I'm living my life. So, but yeah, live it with virtue, and people might look at you dumbfounded, not knowing what it is that you meant.
The word virtue has been banned, as has the word sin, because we can't sit in judgment on other people's behaviors, right? Which is, they're all hypocrites because they're judging other people all the time if they disagree with them, the people that advocate that. They're the most judgmental people going. Everybody in the past was a bigot, for instance. So the trouble is, of course, I say, once you ban the very idea of virtue, that basically virtue is someone else's opinion. It's all down to opinion again. Virtue is someone else's opinion about what you should do, rather than an objectively verifiable fact that in sacrificing myself for others, everybody's happier. That's an objective reality, not an opinion. But once you reduce virtue to that's someone else's opinion of what you should do, then virtue is effectively exorcised from society. And when the angels are exorcised, all that's left are the demons.
Beautiful. I actually was sitting in a homily one time, and the priest said that he looked up sin, and the first definition that came up was something forbidden but delightful, or something like that. Like sinfully delicious or something. So it's just interesting that that sin has been relegated to this something somehow good. And virtue has been banned from society.
You get words like wicked now being used in a positive sense in the culture. And that's wicked. Doesn't mean it's wicked. It means it's good. I mean, when things are upside down like that, you're heading towards the abyss.
Yeah, and relativism is really, really threatening the goodness and the freedom that we have, because if you do go down that path all the way to its end, you will get people, and you are getting people who will say, well, I like killing people. I like hurting people. This is my opinion. This is how I feel. And when you start to say everyone's opinion is I don't want to say it's valid, because everyone's opinion is valid, but when everyone's opinion is somehow gospel truth, you run into this problem.
And when you no longer have the belief that reason can solve differences, the only thing you can solve differences with is violence. Now, if I disagree with you and don't like what you're doing, and I can't reason with you why you shouldn't be doing it, I'll just beat you over the head.
Sadly, yes. Yeah. And it's a similar, yeah. There's another conversation there, but I've said to my husband a lot, we talk about, is World War III coming? And the element that's always unknown is the madman, the person who doesn't care about keeping commerce going, the person who doesn't care because there are other unvirtuous opinions out there where you say, well, I'd rather have war, I'd rather have violence, I'd rather have this or that.
And the problem is now, of course, that we've become too clever to get away with that. I mean, there's a big difference between in The Hobbit. If you want some real genuine, deep philosophy, go to Tolkien. In The Hobbit, the narrator says that orcs make no beautiful things, but many clever ones. And it's not unlikely that they invented many of the devices for killing lots of people at once. In other words, weapons of mass destruction, to use modern terminology. And we've forgotten, right? We live in during COVID, one of the horrific things about COVID was complete blind faith in science, right, to solve problems. And so we now have this naive optimism about, just science will, whatever the problem is, science will solve it. It's a golden age in the future, heralded by science. But amongst other things, science has given us the nuclear bomb, which is still there. So in the old days, a madman might lead an army across a border, You might have a conventional warfare, lots of people will be killed, and the war will have an outcome, and the culture will change accordingly. Now you get a madman who's got fingers on the button, and a whole city is going to be destroyed. And if it escalates, then what is the limit of the destruction that the cleverness of man can now deliver? There's a wonderful poem by Siegfried Sassoon called Litany of the Lost, which was written in 1945, just after the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It talks about the terror of atomic doom foreseen, and the refrain at the end of each stanza is, deliver us from ourselves.
Mm. Mm. Yes, because that is kind of a sort of bleak solution. If you consider all of mankind bad, then, if it's all based on a calculation and everything is a negative, then the end result should be that everything is wiped out. It's unfortunate, but
Yeah,
yeah.
and it could happen. I mean, if Adolf Hitler, for instance, if Adolf Hitler had the bomb, I think he would have used it before he was finally defeated. So that if that scenario has been around in the past, why can it not be around in the future? Now, this is all doom laden stuff. There's two things I would say about that. First of all, Chesterton said, when the whole of society is marching towards the abyss, the wise are in the rear. The thing I would say as an addition to that is, when the abyss becomes visible, everybody will want to be in the rear. So in other words, that there will be a healthy reaction when the abyss becomes obvious.
Mm.
But the other thing is, and the most glorious thing of all, is that the end of the world for each of us comes when we die, which could be tomorrow. And that's when we enter the fullness of reality, which is in the presence of God, if we avoid the other place, is the presence of God for eternity. That's what life's about. There's no other purpose to life except to get to heaven. And that doesn't change, irrespective of how clever we are, what means we have for destroying each other, that we only die once. And that's why the most important thing to keep in mind are the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. Keep that in mind. Keep your eye on the finishing line. And there's nothing the devil or his minions can throw at you that's going to be a problem, or that can keep you from the presence of God ultimately.
Amen.
Amen. And I want a T-shirt now that says "Bring virtue back." Oh, that was great. Thank you for pulling us. I was going to ask you to pull us out of that doom and gloom before we ended, because we are right about at time here. But thank you so much for talking with us today, Joseph.
It's been my pleasure, and look forward to seeing you both at the conference. And I can already taste that first pint of ale, Albert.
I'll have it waiting for you.
Love it. Wonderful. Well, we hope to see you at the conference too. Please don't forget to sign up. Albert, can you give us that link one more time?
Chesterton.org/conference.
Wonderful. Yay. Well, thank you again so much. That's all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope that you'll join us next time on Uncommon Sense as we unpack more of the wit and wisdom of G.K. Chesterton. And remember, Chesterton is always better with friends.